Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best macro analysis to help you successfully invest in financial markets. For our latest analysis, visit macrohive.com. I'm into my statistics, so I've been looking into which pieces have been most read on the Macro Hive website so far in April. The top 3 pieces are 5 things you didn't know about China, a self-explanatory piece. The second has been how to be a successful thematic investor. This was written by former podcast guest Jay Poloski, where he outlined how to add themes to your portfolio. And the third most read piece has been worrying about Biden's capital gains tax headline. Don't. This was written by macro strategist John Tierney, and I wonder whether this was read because readers were hoping to agree with the headline. Anyway, the range of these articles give you a sense of what you can get as a member of Macro Hive. And on top of these sorts of pieces, you can also access our member Slack room, which contains a healthy, interactive discussion on markets, quite different from what you get on Twitter. And becoming a member is easy. You go to the Macro Hive website, you sign up, and your first month is free, and then it's only the cost of a few weekly cappuccinos. It's well worth it, and many call Macro Hive the hidden gem for investors. So once again, sign up at macrohive.com. We're also proud to have Moonfair sponsor this episode once again. Moonfair believes exceptional investors deserve exceptional returns. Returns like those offered by carefully selected top-tier private equity funds, an asset class that has been for decades out of reach of most investors. Given the current volatility in stock markets, the specter of inflation, low yields on most classic fixed income products, and the advent of all manner of unproven asset classes, Moonfair believes private equity has a place in every portfolio. No less than Fidelity International, the global arm of Fidelity, one of the largest asset managers in the world, recently selected Moonfair as its exclusive distribution partner for private equity funds, a confirmation of Moonfair's obsession with picking the best fund managers and strategies across private equity buyouts, venture capital, growth equity. Moonfair also offers funds from top managers running strategies related to co-investment, infrastructure, secondaries, and credit. And nearly 1,500 investors have trusted Moonfair so far with their money, and the company is hurtling towards €1 billion assets under management. It recently launched a new and improved secondary market in partnership with Lexington, one of the largest private equity secondary fund managers in the world, giving investors the flexibility to exit their position before a fund's holding period elapses. So to get started, please visit moonfair.com/macrohive. That's moonfair.com/macrohive and create your free profile. There, you can also check out Moonfair's library of white papers exploring different topics around private markets investing, along with some of Moonfair's favorite episodes of the podcast. Completing a Moonfair profile is completely free and without any obligations, and will give you access to Moonfair's platform where you can see which funds are available, check due diligence documentation, and connect with Moonfair's Investor Solutions team. So I do urge you to go to moonfair.com/macrohive. Not least, it will allow you to get to see how many of the leading private equity funds in the world operate. Now, on to this episode's guest. It's Wolfgang Münchau. Wolfgang is co-founder and director of Eurointelligence, a specialist service for news and analysis of the EU and Eurozone. He was a Financial Times columnist from 2003 until 2020, and that's how I've known and followed him over the years. And while he was at the FT, he became the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Financial Times Deutschland. He's also the author of several books, including Meltdown Years. So on to our conversation. So welcome, Wolfgang, to our podcast. It's great to have you on.
Hello, Bilal. Thank you for having me.
Well, before we jump into the meat of our conversation, I always like to ask our guests something about their background, particularly what you studied at university and why did you go into the field that you went into and how did you end up where you are now?
What I studied had nothing to do with what I did. I studied mathematics and business studies at various times, but I did not become a mathematician. I decided to become a journalist. And started off in a local newspaper in Germany for a very short time.
But that's an unusual thing, isn't it? To do maths and then go into journalism. I mean, what made you want to do that? I mean, that's a bit of an interesting...
None of my classmates did this. I always wanted to become a journalist, but, you don't start studying it in a way that, you just study something you like. And I like those things. The business economics background gave me, some serious applied knowledge. My passion was always mathematics, still to this day. And I've always kept up with this as a sort of an intellectual discipline. But journalism was something, I did. So it's a duality of my mind, I suspect. But journalism was always I was always attracted to it. I don't think, I was particularly talented for it. So I didn't think it was. But, I got into it, and then, I was in England. I went to England to go to journalism school. I got a job. I didn't expect to get a job. I got a job. Later, I ended up at the Times newspaper. I didn't expect that to happen, and things sort of went on from there. So basically, the journalism, which was something like, I just wanted to do for a certain period of time, became what I did. That's how often careers, happen.
And then you ended up at the Financial Times, and that was your home for a long time.
Yes, I did. I ended up there at 1995. And shortly afterwards, they asked me to participate in the launch of the FT Deutschland, the German paper of the FT at the time. And I was the editor of that paper at one point. And then I returned to the UK in 2003 to become a columnist of the Financial Times, which I the column I'd written for a very long time.
Great. Okay, no, that's good. And I've been reading your columns for a long, long time, and you're one of my go-to people for, to getting insights into Europe. And there's a lot going on in Europe, both in the headlines and, beneath the headlines. And I suppose perhaps we can start with Germany. And there's a lot of news coming out of Germany. One big story, I guess, has been the CDU leadership confirmation, I guess, of Laschet, and then also the rise of the Green Party. So perhaps you can kind of give us your sort of high-level thoughts on the state of sort of German leadership as we go into the elections later this year.
We are at the moment in the most unusual election campaign that I can remember, certainly since 1998. There are some parallels with the 98 elections when Kohl lost against Söder. Some people draw comparisons to the 1969 election when there was a genuine change of government. There was the end of a 20-year regime, CDU regime. I don't want to make predictions. Laschet is an extraordinarily weak candidate so far. He's unpopular. Party is also quite unpopular at the time. There are a lot of CDU folk who think, well, Kohl was unpopular and it didn't matter. But the CDU was quite popular at the time. And others say, the CDU wasn't particularly popular under Merkel, but she was popular. But, Laschet is unpopular and his party is unpopular. It's a bad combination. He is, I often call him the coal guy. At Eurointelligence, what is sort of my main activity right now, we have been looking at European energy policy for a very consistently long period. And, we talked about Laschet long before he became a chancellor candidate or a CDU chairman. We talked about him. I talked to him as the coal guy. And he was the guy who was basically the politician most instrumental in prolonging Germany's exit from the coal industry. And there's been a long debate, not just among politicians, but civil society groups, companies, state governments, to get sort of a mega coal compromise going and to manage the exit from this industry. And he held against this because he has got a big coal mining area in his state, which is North Rhine-Westphalia. He's often seen in steelworks and coal areas. His views of industrial policies are very much about machines and old industry. So for me, the main issue in this election, you have a candidate in the CDU. If you just look at the CDU-CSU itself, you have Markus Söder, who is a very slick politician. He's the prime minister of Bavaria and the chairman of the CSU. But he's also, as a man who leads a government in Munich, that is Germany's most modern town in terms of its, it's the only high-tech city of any, significance that Germany has. His interest is in those industries, artificial intelligence, pharmaceutical research, some of the stuff that's been going on. Laschet has not really been. This is a very different perspective those two people had. Now, Laschet won this contest. This has been going on for a while.
I mean, why? Why has he done so well? I mean, he doesn't seem very popular. He seems kind of old-fashioned. So how did he get the nomination? I mean, the CDU had the problem with AKK before. So, they've got some experience of picking the wrong horse. And so why did this happen?
You would think that they would pick the person most likely to win the election. That's not how the CDU works. The CDU is all about jockeying after the 16 years of Merkel as chancellor, and then another 4 years as Merkel as CDU chairman or chairwoman. People are now jockeying for position. There's now a post-Merkel era seats to be filled, and the state premiers, the regional chiefs, they all want to be heard. And Laschet's strength is he is a very efficient, chairman. Literally, he chairs meetings. He's the guy who lets everybody in. He's, not being the youngest anymore. He's least likely to be there for another 16 years as she was. And any young person would rather have an old guy who retires in 4 years or 5 years or so than young Söder, who might just hang on for a long time. The opposition to Söder in the CDU is not because they think he can't win elections. They're afraid of him precisely because they think he can. And if the CSU, which is the smaller partner, occupies the chancellery, this is a power shift. And that's how they think. They think in terms of power. And then the argument about the elections, the usual political argument is saying, this is another 5 months, things will intrude. And, in reality, they do. Things will change in 4 months. I mean, people are upset about the way Laschet managed this. This was pretty much a backroom stitch up, the way he got the nomination. And many people got upset. But if his poll ratings were to recover, all that will be forgotten. But if it won't, then there could be some interesting dynamics. I've been one of the things that we've been writing in Eurointelligence has been the prospect of a split between the CDU and the CSU. That's not on the cards now. It's not on the cards before the elections. But it is a scenario. There is a scenario in which Laschet does badly, and Söder does relatively well in Bavaria. And that would be a scenario in which the CSU might be prompted to think it is better off to become a national party, which it never did before. There has been a poll out there that suggested that the CSU would actually under Söder would get more votes than the CDU under Laschet nationwide. Now, these are hypothetical polls. Once you do this, then you test the reality, and the reality might be very different. It's just, I think the CSU would have taken that in as a piece of information rather than as, let's do this. But, they've taken an interesting step. They have started to open up to online membership to people outside Bavaria. It's the first time that happened. And while nobody made a big fuss about it, they are testing the waters. That's for sure.
And just on that, if they were, this is hypothetical, of course, if they were to split, would that happen before the federal election, or would that happen afterwards as a reaction to a bad election outcome?
I would think there are scenarios. Let's just take the scenario. There is a state election in the state of Saxony-Anhalt in June. If the CDU completely destroys itself there. And there is a scenario where things might just come to a head beforehand. June is about the last moment where it could happen. Then you have 3 months until the election campaign. You're not going to start. The CSU there would be no legal impediments for the CSU, because to become a separate party, you can do that at any time. The German electoral law allows the party, because the CSU is already represented in the federal parliament. It can just, it doesn't have to apply. It doesn't have to fulfill, it doesn't have to do all the stuff that new parties have to do. And so that can be organized pretty quickly. So it's a very, very low probability scenario. So let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Also, it's not a thing that the Söder, the chairman, can decide by himself. There are lots of vested interest in the party. He needs to carry the party along. But if the sense in the party is that they would lose seats because of the poor performance of the candidate, then there may well be a groundswell of opinion in Bavaria that this has gone enough, and that that if the CDU wants to run with a weak candidate, then it's probably best to decouple from that. I think that argument I expect that argument to be made.
And why is, you mentioned a poll, obviously just one poll that was conducted recently that showed more support for CSU over the current CDU. Why is the CSU more popular? Is it to do with Söder? Is it to do with Bavaria? What is it that makes the CSU more popular?
We had in German history 2 times a CSU candidate, both of them who lost the election. And it's hard to sell a Bavarian Catholic to the northern Protestant voters of Germany. But Söder is a Protestant. He is from northern Bavaria, which is, he doesn't. It's a very different part of Bavaria than the sort of the southern part. Bavaria is tragic.
Is this Protestant Catholic thing important? These got religious dominations.
It's not so much that the religion is important, but it's the character is important. Söder isn't your classic Bavarian. He doesn't come across as your classic Bavarian. And, he has there is a character. I mean, he is, obviously a man with a regional identity, but so is everybody else in Germany. Laschet has a regional identity and Söder just has another one. But it's not like, there is this strange Bavarian and, who's going to, it's no longer that, there was a certain foreigner thing about it. Nobody would say. But that isn't the case with him. But the reason he's popular is because he's very slick. I mean, astonishingly slick for a German politician. And because he represents a new era. He's younger, but he also speaks a different language. He's much more direct in his language. He doesn't use the kind of classic political language of, hedging your bets and saying nothing in a long speech. He's very direct. People like the way he was steadfast during the coronavirus crisis. He supported Merkel throughout. Laschet was all over the place. I mean, he considered himself pragmatic. Laschet, then he closed down, then he opened up, and he's basically been saying, we have to run a pro-business course, and then he closed down again. Nobody really knew what he was. That's part of his problems, that he hasn't had a very consistent policy. And you remember in the UK, when in year one, Boris Johnson was pretty unpopular, his handling of the crisis, because it wasn't consistent. But it's only when it became consistent, which was really starting Christmas, with a vaccination program, a lockdown plan that is medium term, that is based on certain criteria, that has clear marks. We all know that on May the 17th is when the next step is, and then something in June and maybe in the summer. So there are clear waypoints. That didn't happen in Germany, and certainly didn't happen in North Rhine-Westphalia. And there was this faction around Merkel, which was, Söder was part of that, who wanted a similarly strong, clear-headed approach. And Laschet was one of those who opposed it. So that kind of explains his popularity in part, but generally it is about character. This is a very different character. What people like, and there are some people who say, I recently saw a discussion in German television who, somebody says, I don't trust Söder because it's not a guy I would like to go on holiday. And you get sort of people who have, Laschet is sort of there's nothing really nasty about Laschet. He's a kind of a nice guy. And the question is that people do not necessarily see him as a chancellor, and he will have to persuade people that this is indeed the case. At the moment, the polls, as we observed in our briefing this morning, the polls are all over the place. They would show the CDU sometimes at 28%, sometimes at 23% or 21%. You'll see massive fluctuations even for some of the small parties like the FDP or the SPD. The SPD is between 13 and 18%, which is a super large fluctuation margin, which reflects a lot of the uncertainty that's at the moment. There's a lot of voters shifting from one part to the other. And another point we wrote about this morning was the peculiarity of the German electoral system, because people have two votes. They have a first vote in which people elect a constituency MP. And like in the UK, the person who comes first gets in, but the remainder are made up from lists. And the sum total of everything would reflect the proportional number of the votes. So the CSU is a party that pretty much gets all of its first candidates through, and virtually all of its MPs are directly elected. But there are parties like smaller parties like the Greens, for example. They have hardly any directly elected, but virtually all their MPs are from the lists. So you could, for example, find a situation that a voter votes CSU in the first vote, like a Bavarian voter, and vote for the Greens in the second vote. And that is basically a form of tactical voting. And my reading of the polls is that this volatility and fluctuation also across the polling organizations, which is more than unusual. There's always some fluctuation, but this is a very different. We're in a very different realm now. Reflects some of the tactical voting, not only tactical, the extent of it, but also shifts of it that are happening. There's all to play for. Greens have come up with a very competent candidate, Annalena Baerbock, who's their co-leader. She had a terrific start to her campaign. She's very focused on issues. The Greens appeal to urbanites. They're a modern party. Söder mischievously said that she is far more modern than Laschet. Which is true. But it seems to me that Söder might vote for her too. So there are, you will find some odd coalitions coming up, and not just the classic left-right, but it's more like old new. That's a much more important.
And in terms of like potential implications of the Greens being in government, I mean, what are some of the important changes that could happen if they were to come into power?
That would depend on whether they are kind of, in which format they would come into power. If they came in as a junior coalition partner to the CDU under a Laschet government, they would get, junior partners, especially if they are almost as large as the other parties. Say if the CDU got in with 25% and they got 24%, and that would just be enough for a government. In a situation like that, they would take the finance ministry, and their first priority would be, my guess, they would take finance and foreign. And their first priority would be they can't reform the German debt brake, the fiscal stability rule, but they can manage it differently. So my reading of their policy is that they would favor a much more gradual exit from the fiscal deficit, the COVID-related deficit. So we might find a whole decade of deficits. And there are ways, a debt brake, while it assumes a balanced budget, pretty much most of the time, there are ways around it, for as long as there is a majority in the parliament for that. And most importantly, also, they would favor a reform of the Stability Pact in the EU. So you would think that is a big thing. That's a really big deal. I would think if they became also occupied the foreign ministry, we would probably see a gradual, but not a radical departure from this sort of mercantilist foreign policy. And German foreign policy is all about business. They never criticize China's human rights violation or whatever happens in Russia, maybe some background diplomacy. But the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, there's a lot of vested business interests at stake here. And that's what they do, whatever America and others might say. The Greens have a slightly different they have a very different set of priorities. And we would probably see, not an immediate and radical shift, but we would see a shift where human rights might take a somewhat marginally larger role than it does today. And in terms of the fiscal spending, that would be the result of the fiscal relaxation. And obviously that would go into investment programs, digital programs, environmental programs. But it's interesting, the Greens are very big on digital investments. So their appeal is not just green. That's obviously part of it. But they appeal to sort of a broader coalition of younger people who want to see investment. And Germany is just hopelessly underinvested digital.
On the underinvestment side, I mean, that's common criticism of Germany. I mean, is it true that there's been structural underinvestment and infrastructure is kind of creaking in Germany in all kind of domains?
I'll give you an example. The various the local health departments, when they communicate with each other, they use the fax machine. I mean, that's basically, police are always complaining they don't have computers. Yeah, the country is massive. You get people think that their mobile phone, when they visit Germany, think their mobile phone is broken down, when in fact there are large areas of the country which has no coverage of mobile phones. The cities have, but many rural areas don't.
But how can the infrastructure be so poor when Germany has all these leading manufacturing companies? I mean, they're world class.
Well, the manufacturing companies are connected, of course. But if you're making widgets, industrial widgets, you don't necessarily need a lot of computers to make them. Some, obviously you might need some specialist machines to do this. You might need robots. There is certainly some technology in there as well. But it is a sort of it's kind of a hybrid thing between old and new. But it's not like one shouldn't imagine a German company being a hyper digitalized concern. That is not the case. I mean, in companies you would find that people are using computers. This is not the case. This is definitely so, but it's not as, if you go to shops, the use of phones for payment, of credit cards, of electronic means of payment, this is just not nearly as advanced there as it is in virtually every country in Europe. Germany has the worst mobile phone network in the whole of the EU. That includes countries that are significantly poorer than Germany, because Germany has decided. I do remember when they had these auctions, the 3G auctions in the early 2000s, when the government got a lot of money from the phone companies. 70s. It was like a profit maximizing, the auctioneering was a profit maximizing project for the government. But they overlooked that because the companies got squeezed, they only invested in the most profitable parts of the network, so that they were willing to keep big parts of the country uncovered. And still today, there are government people who say, "Oh, we don't need to have every farm connected." Kind of a mentality where you wonder. I mean, I would say, especially the farms need to be connected. You really want everybody connected. I mean, you don't want to start saying only the big cities, only where it's worth. You don't want to think about, when you talk about networks, you don't want to think about value for money or efficiency. The whole idea of a network is that really everybody's connected. Well, 5G should make that possible, or make it easier, because you get interconnectivity, so that if you are, that would radically change the availability of networks, but they would still have to, invest quite a bit. So the Greens would probably be the party of investment. That's sort of their main appeal. And so even if you're not necessarily a person voted Green last time, they got 10% about 10 or 11% last time, and now they're polling at 24, 25%. That is not, they didn't double or triple their electorate, not because people have become greener, but because the Greens, the current generation of Greens appeals to a wider set of people, especially younger people, who would have probably voted for SPD or CDU last time.
Yeah. And you mentioned this sort of scenario where the Greens are a junior partner, but let's say they were to become the dominant partner, then what's the implication of that?
If they become the dominant partner in the CDU, CSU, I would think if it's a coalition with the CDU, CSU, the main thing would be the Greens would then occupy the Chancellery, and then the CDU would then occupy the Finance Ministry. You might actually find a scenario where the Greens are the dominant partner, that they might actually do less, because while the Chancellery is obviously a very important part of the government, and if a Chancellor is very skillful, knows how to use power, you will find that the CDU will probably be the fiscally conservative element of the government. The interesting constellation would be if the Greens and the SPD form a coalition, maybe either with the FDP or even the Left Party. Now, take the example of a coalition of the Greens, the SPD, and the Left Party. Now, the Greens would be the most conservative element. I mean, they are in favor of they are in favor of defense spending. They're in favor of, they support America's policy on Russia. They support America's policy on China, which is obviously not something the Left Party would. So there would be plenty of conflict, but they all agree on investment, and they all agree on dismantling the Stability Pact and the debt brake. So you could see potentially a very significant fiscal expansion. There would still not be a majority for constitutional reform to get rid of the debt brake, but the German parliament can suspend it every single year. So if you have the simple majority, and you declare some kind of a fiscal state of emergency, and you can do this. I mean, you could say the COVID crisis has been so fundamental that we need a much more gradual adjustment process. So they could do this for 4 years and keep deficits of 3-4% going, while the CDU would ideally, get rid of these deficits gradually within 2 or 3 years and just have, return to the zero or even a surplus. So that would allow a significant higher degree of fiscal expansion. This is not a scenario I expect to happen. I mean, this would be sort of a government of the very left, the three. I mean, if I would no longer classify the Greens as a party of the left. They're kind of a cloud that sort of spans various positions. They are conservative in some areas, or positions that would be considered conservative. Let's just put it this way. I don't think that the German politics at the moment is actually well classified in terms of left and right. The SPD has moved very much to the center. I fail to see the left in it. CDU has, under Merkel, moved to the center. The reason it has lost a lot of its sort of classic nationalist crowd, who are now gone, some of them have gone to the AfD, which is a party of the far right. Interestingly, they're not doing well from all these troubles. They're kind of stuck at 9 to 10% in the polls. There's not much movement for them.
And why do you think that is?
They have been internally divided. General rule is that, there are not many general rules that apply all the time, but one of them in politics, but one of them is that divided parties don't do well in elections, and that's the case at the moment. They're all far right. I mean, we have to basically say it. So I'm trying to distinguish between far right moderates and far right extremists is sort of something I struggle with. But they have a faction. They have people who've marched with neo-Nazis. They have people who are neo-Nazis in the party, and there's a big row in the leadership of whether these people should be expelled or not. And there has been this row has overshadowed the entire debate they've had.
And on the lockdown side, Germany initially seemed to have managed COVID well, but as time has gone on, it seems to have mismanaged it sort of further. One is, why has there been sort of mismanagement? And there seems to be a bit of a backlash. There seems to be sort of talk of like corruption, like contracts given to companies and things like that. I mean, what's been the kind of the fallout from COVID on the political side?
It's a challenge they massively underestimated. I mean, people always think of Germany as a very disciplined country, and that's probably true in areas that are well organized from the start, but the health system is not. The health system is very good, but it's a very good sort of privately managed, decentralized system, but it does not cope well with crisis. You not only have corruption, but you even have people cheating on the vaccination. There were stories that children got vaccinated because they knew some doctors, and a lot of young people who got the vaccination because they found ways to manage the queues. Some politicians said, "Oh, let's be pragmatic." I mean, all this stuff about pragmatism is about cheating, and there's another word. So obviously, the more young people get vaccinated, the fewer old people get vaccinated. So if you want to get herd immunity for the groups that are most vulnerable, then each young person that gets vaccinated is really a setback in your system. This is the same happened in Italy, where they started off with the young people because they felt they followed some other sort of ideal, where the vaccination rate of old people is very low and who will take a very, very long time to get to the level of herd immunity that the UK has achieved right now, because the UK has actually a lower rate of vaccination for young people than both Italy and Germany. And, in the UK, nobody under 40 at the moment is vaccinated. Almost nobody, except a few people who've been, working for the NHS in that age group. But generally, there is no way in the UK to get through the system. The system is so tightly managed. That is not the case there. And, it has become very difficult for the central government to coordinate the work of the state governments. They are basically the health state. The federal government did not want to, they just introduced legislation to introduce some national controls. That has just happened, was just signed into law by the president. So they can order a lockdown when the infection rates exceeds a certain threshold, which it has now done in many, many local areas. So that means schools will have to close and people will have to stay at home overnight, and various restrictions will apply.
And who's lost out politically from this, would you say? Like, has Merkel lost the popularity? I mean, I guess she's less significant now, I suppose, but like, have CDU lost out from this, or?
Her personal popularity has not changed much. She's still a very popular leader. But the CDU before the pandemic, the CDU polled around 28%. Then during the pandemic, it got to 40%, because people wanted reassurance that a strong government, and people always trusted the CDU to deliver, stability in a crisis. When people realized that didn't happen, they fell back to be, actually now below 28%. So that additional support the CDU received was a very temporary one. You can't blame Laschet for the low poll ratings. The CDU was at that level before the crisis. So it is on a secularly declining trend. I think, whenever something happens, Germany had a very good first wave. Everybody was saying, what is it about Germany? They had a good health. They have a good health system, but we don't exactly know why some countries had a good first wave and some didn't. And people draw. I note that especially with economists. Economists become virologists. They draw sort of these conclusions. You cannot know anything from this data. Even today, we can make very few big assumptions from the data about how the lockdown has worked. And we know now, there is now an accumulation of data now after a year, that most of the infections occur in closed rooms rather than outdoors. Now that seems to be a robust knowledge, but to say that the Swedish experiment either succeeded or failed, we don't know. And people have strong views about it because, for reasons that have to do with their vanity or their own position or their belief whether people should trust experts or not. But the Swedish experiment is inconclusive, we have to say.
And is there some like political parties or individuals that have turned like anti-lockdown on kind of civil rights ground, human rights grounds or something?
It's basically on sort of libertarian freedom grounds. There's been a big campaign in Germany by libertarians who object to it in principle or who make the case that it is not proportionate, so that where the lockdown has been devised. So this might go, and I think, there is at the moment an attempt to prepare a case in front of the German Constitutional Court to test the law that has just been signed, that has just been implemented. It's quite possible that the Constitutional Court might either strike it down or more likely might just limit the law. It might just say, okay, you can do that, but you need to demonstrate that the measures are effective, and not all measures are effective. For example, the measure that the night curfew is the one that identified by the campaigners as the most vulnerable thing, so that they think they have a chance to overturn that one. I think they're not doing themselves any favors, and which I find amazing about the German debate, it's astonishing and disturbing, is that the lockdown debate happens almost independently from the vaccination debate and almost independently from the infections debate. So that lockdown is almost like something that you decide as something that is, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. And as a principle ground, you wouldn't say, okay, we have to do it when infections are right, when people are in danger, and then, we can relax the lockdown once we have reached a certain immunity levels. For this is also the reason why there wasn't so much political pressure in the period from December to March when the vaccination levels were so low. Now they have picked up since. So I would say the vaccination crisis is over. People, they're now vaccinating at a full speed. People are saying there may be some setbacks coming, but that's hard to predict. But so far, things in April, things picked up strongly. After Easter, they picked up. And so there should be some degree of protection by the summer. Whether they can actually go on holiday, they all think they will. They all think that holidays are, that's not sure. And there are also problems with, the Indian virus, the Indian mutant of the virus is now becoming a problem. And it's hard to say. In Germany, the infections are not as high as they are in France, the rate, and they are stagnating at a level of about 160, 170 infections per 100,000 of the population, compares to about less than 30 in the UK right now. But the UK had significantly higher numbers during its second wave. In the winter, when these numbers spiked to high levels, the rate was much, much, much higher.
But in Germany, are we seeing kind of like hospitals reaching capacity and ICU units full and, all of those sorts of things?
We see degree of local stress, but nothing like what you saw in the UK. The health system is on the whole coping, and there is no impact on non-COVID related things. So the system works in full. It's not like that anyone gets their treatment postponed because of COVID. The system, the health system, the German health system is a very, very well equipped. It's a very good system, very expensive system, but it is it's coping well under the stress. That's not the problem. The problem is the actual management of the vaccination process. This is not something for which Germany is well equipped.
Yeah, and now I just wanted to widen out the conversation to Europe's response. This is something you've written a lot about in your various reports at Eurointelligence. But one thing is there's a lot of hype around the European Recovery Fund, last year, and you've been emphasizing a lot about the difference between spending versus loan guarantees, number one. So it'd be good to kind of get some of your thoughts around the recovery fund. And then secondly, from understanding, there's a potential German constitutional challenge on the recovery fund. So if you could just address those two, and then we can go from there.
Yes. Okay. The recovery fund was sort of meant to be sort of Europe's big response. And it's, and people, journalists in particular, they love big headlines. So they talked about the 50 billion fund, but you can't add up loans and grants. There are two different categories. But in particular, you can't say it's 5% or 6% of GDP. You can't take a 5-year program and then set it against single years of GDP. That's, kind of dishonest. If you actually look at the grants component, which is the fiscal component, grants is money that you get, you don't have to repay. We come to a number of about 0.3 to 0.4% of GDP per year for 5 years. And there's a loan component, which is now same amount again, a bit more. So you would come, if you included that, you would come to 0.7, 0.8% of GDP for this period. But alone is not a fiscal thing. I'm not saying it's a useless thing. It because it's earmarked for investments. And with the austerity years during the Eurozone crisis, led to a drought in investment. This is the reason why Germany, we just talked about it, has invested so little into digital infrastructure, because that's how that surplus happened. The surplus didn't happen because people were paying higher taxes. They just stopped investing. And countries like Italy is pretty dramatic. So they will get money to invest into digital infrastructure, into road infrastructure, into a higher speed railway network, into hospitals, into some school investments that were not done. And that's very useful. And especially since these investments are accompanied, because that's the conditionality, these investments are accompanied by structural reforms. Now we have to see how that pans out, but in an ideal sense, it could be a very useful structural reform facility. But it's not a fiscal stimulus, and I think one has to be very clear about that. A fiscal stimulus is what the US just did. 1.9 trillion in 1 year. It's 10% or something like that of GDP. That's a fiscal stimulus. Now we didn't do anything like in Europe. We don't do fiscal stimulus in Europe, not much. We just did the least. We just gave guarantees, and the people always do that. They always mix up guarantees and actual spending.
I mean, what about the idea of euro-denominated bonds, that this will somehow sort of turbocharge a euro-denominated bond market?
The idea, it would only turbocharge a European bond market if this became perpetualized. So if this recovery fund became the first of many, if the 2020 budget had the next recovery fund, just maybe under a different name, but if sort of the idea of a Eurozone or an EU-based lending and programs, investment programs funded by them, if this turned into the kernel of an EU fiscal union, and this gets us to the German Constitutional Code, because the German Constitutional Code probably won't block the recovery fund. They didn't grant an injunction. They were asked to grant an injunction that they refused. The little they said about it is that there is certainly the parliaments have the right to do this. In principle, if they want to help each other, then they have the court will not object to it. But the court will rule on this case. This case is in front of them. It will take a couple of years, and they will, as they always do, they don't ever block things. But what they do is they lay down principles that bind the government. I mean, the reason we don't have a fiscal union in the EU after 20 years of Eurozone crises, we still don't have a fiscal union. This is not because the German Constitutional Code blocked anything. It never blocked anything, in fact, but because the German Constitutional Code bound the hands of the German government in the negotiations. The German government can constitutionally, from legally, not agree to a fiscal union. It is against the German Constitution. The Constitutional Code has made it clear that this is not possible. And it will make it very clear in its next ruling. It will, whatever gray zones we may have, legal gray zones we may have, it will turn them into black and white.
I mean, what is it in the Constitution specifically that prevents this?
The Constitution has a sort of a strong definition of sovereignty, that sovereignty cannot be shared. I mean, this is not an exact definition. They have what is called the democracy principle, and it means that democracy, or the sovereign right, has to be lodged in a very clear place. So a parliament cannot bind future parliaments. So a parliament has the total fiscal sovereignty, and it's been re-elected every 4 years, and it cannot bind future parliaments. So it cannot accept lending that go beyond it cannot force another parliament to repay a loan that they have decided to raise. Say a country were to default, say Italy were to default on a bond, then Germany would, in theory, have to pay up for this. And the idea that a fiscal decision is taken that is not been voted on by the German electorate, that's basically one of the several things they object to. The other thing which is objectionable is that, and one has to remember that, the whole recovery fund was based on an article in the Lisbon Treaty that guarantees or that allows countries to help each other in an emergency. It was an emergency clause. Now, if you look at the spending of the recovery fund, there are green spending and digital spending, and you're asking, what has that got to do with the COVID emergency? So they're basically, this is a very normal spending program. It doesn't look like an emergency program. In fact, you could have argued a fiscal stimulus. Now that would have been an emergency program. That would have actually qualified. But this kind of structural thing that they're now doing could actually run into danger. They could run into legal trouble if the court believes or comes to the conclusion that an an emergency program cannot be a 5-year structural program unless you make a very clear case that COVID destroyed these structures, which is maybe possible for the health sector, but the digital infrastructure was hardly destroyed by the virus. So the argument, the EU has been kind of getting around not being illegal. I mean, they as lawyers and they've thought they were on very strong grounds. Certainly in European law, they're on strong grounds, but they've always been exploiting gray zones. Even what Mario Draghi did was an exploitation of gray zones. When he did whatever it takes, there wasn't a legal ruling that said he could do that. It came later. The court later said that was a perfectly legal thing. However, the court also imposed conditions that weren't there before. The court was very clear about what was possible and what wasn't possible. The European court, that is. So where we started in the monetary union 20 years ago, it was full of legal gray zones, and there's a lot of clarity now about what the central bank is allowed to do, what the governments are allowed to do. And my reading of the situation is that the recovery fund is a perfectly legal one-off instrument, provided you don't extend it too far. But it cannot be used cannot be turned into a fiscal union. And that will eventually create an existential conflict between German constitutional law and the EU political preferences. And it's not, I don't think the German constitutional court will ever put itself into a position where it says no, but it will force the German government to take that position.
So all this talk of, there's a higher chance of a fiscal union now, you think that's overstated?
I don't see it. I mean, that's basically if you don't understand the politics. I mean, it's Brussels thinks that, but from a Brussels perspective, they found the way. They thought this method. It was a sort of a technical method they first used for this European unemployment fund, which they agreed a year earlier, and it was also at the beginning of the crisis, but it preceded the recovery fund by a few months. And this was a sort of a reinsurance fund for unemployment and for unemployment insurance systems, and they used this method of issuing joint bonds that are guaranteed by member states, but raised by the EU, and that was sort of the method. And they thought, well, that method can now be extended to the recovery fund and can be extended to the next budget. We can basically keep that rolling over. And now they will certainly try. There will be a very significant attempt to do that, but I'm skeptical that this will become permanent.
And you mentioned the ECB, just kind of this is more for an open general question, but how do you think Lagarde's doing? And then also the ECB's push towards green policies? I mean, is that viable or not? Or is that kind of encroaching into territory that isn't really a central bank's territory?
A central bank has to support, the general policy of the government or in this case, the European Commission. It's part of what a central bank does. I'm a little bit surprised how often Lagarde talks about green policies and how, in comparison, how little she talks about monetary policies. I mean, it's not so much that I don't think they should do this, and there are issues in the bond, for example, the bond purchase strategy, where one needs to look at issues of market neutrality. There are serious issues, that the central bank needs to address. But the main issue for the central bank is not that at the moment, and for the next 10 years, the main issue is really managing to get out of this crisis. Managing to do this in a way that is both economically optimal and legally feasible. Again, we will have legal issues coming up about the PEP program, the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. The question is, how fast will the ECB have to unwind its purchases? There are people on its governing council who will press for the purchase to be tapered, not only reduced in net accumulation, but in terms of sold, unwound, driven back to where it was. That will be a big debate coming up, and the president will have to play a leading role in that debate. We can't judge her performance. I mean, when she became president, she was mostly inherited a policy. Then came the crisis, and they did what they had to do. And there isn't really a lot of stuff that happened in terms of creative stuff that like it happened the previous time, where Draghi had they did QE, they did the TLTROs. I mean, the wholly different monetary policy instruments were developed in that period. That hasn't happened yet, other than the PEP program, which is kind of more of the same. With the only sort of original thing about it is that it didn't have to observe all these very self-imposed rules because it was an emergency program. program. But in the long run, those rules, they will have to go back to those rules. And, I don't know what the strategy is going to be. So I see big conflicts ahead in the ECB and that will require, and, I think the judgment will come, in future years, but that will require a very determined leadership. And it will require a central bank president who's really got the eyes on the ball.
And then more generally, when you look at kind of the global picture, the EU seems to be kind of at the vanguard of climate change policy. I mean, is that kind of fair, or is that more talk than action? Or how do you look at the climate policy of Europe?
The EU is very good at selling its policies, and it has a lot of people who just believe anything they say. A lot of gullible fanboys in its network. The EU, if you look at the climate change, they have this Green Deal, then they have a 30% investment spending target. But if you know about the taxonomy of this, they have 3 layers, and then for investment to classify investment projects. One category 0, one is 40%, one is 100%. Now that's not only the EU, that's sort of a general internationally agreed rule. But if you have just take an example. If you have a coal mine that just invests in a veggie burger canteen or something, you already, that investment would qualify for 40% because it's because every investment you make gets up rounded to the next degree. So a 1% green content gets upgraded, rounded up to 40%, doesn't get rounded down to 0. So you have basically quite a lot of, that was also criticized by the European Court of Auditors, this what is technical terms known as a taxonomy of how do you actually categorize these things properly. There is no way the EU spending is 30% green. They make it green, but it's not, they account for it green. My other favorite example was the Juncker investment fund, the 300 billion investment fund. If you actually look down at what happened, there's hardly anything because it was an exercise of reclassification. And the EU is very good at that. This is very technical. You can employ large numbers of people who can actually reclassify things for you pretty conveniently, and then you have a large PR department that can write fantastic press releases and media that report it verbatim. But in the end, the EU is probably, the EU has technology on the environmental side, but it's still an open game. I still think that even the United States, which is behind the EU, could still overtake the EU in terms of emissions cuts or in terms of environmental technologies. Because success in this business, as in other business, will ultimately depend on investment. The EU is not doing well in high tech and digital. It's not doing well in artificial intelligence. So a lot of the modern areas are weak. The EU is doing well, is still in there with a chance on the environmental investment. And to this extent, the success of the Green parties, which we talked about earlier, is perhaps quite important. Because if we revert to fiscal austerity after this and low investments, then we would fall behind in that area as well. It's no accident that our fiscal rules coincided with the technological decline. I'm not saying that all investment should be state, but if the state basically thinks it needs to run a surplus, then that has a broader macroeconomic implication. That's generally not understood in the EU.
Just to wrap up this conversation, we could go on to other topics, but I want to kind of conclude here somewhat. What are some of the big risks that kind of worry you about Germany, Europe?
What the Eurozone crisis has shown us is that the Eurozone is not sustainable. That doesn't mean it will collapse, but it means that it is not a sustainable monetary union as constructed right now. If you take in what everybody says it should be, or it wants to be, or it does not want to be, that can't be. So, either the Germans and the Dutch and the Northerners will eventually accept the need of a fiscal union, for which they will need to change their domestic constitutions, or face down the constitutional courts, or find some kind of solution to their either real or self-imposed problems. Or the south of Europe converges to the north in a way that I find hard to see, even with the recovery fund. That's part of the recovery fund idea, that you get convergence, and when you have convergence, all the imperfections that we have matter less. So you will need to create a fiscal union. That will be that thing, and I don't see that happening. And I don't see it happening on the scale that's needed. There's always a press release that can tell you it's a fiscal union. Like there's a press release that tells you the recovery fund is 750 billion. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. But the reality is that it isn't 750 billion. The reality is that the fiscal element of it is much less. It is in fiscal terms almost statistical noise compared to the much bigger spending stuff that you see in places like Japan, the United States, or China, or even the UK. So the fiscal union has yet to happen. And without it, I don't think the Eurozone will be either successful or sustainable. I'm not saying it will and somebody will pull out. At the moment, nobody has an incentive to pull out. So that is not necessarily the way this will go. But you may find that, modern monetary unions may not only collapse, they might just wither. You may find that we talked at the time of the Eurozone crisis, we talked a lot about parallel currencies. Now we have cryptocurrencies. Who knows? If people in 30, 40 years, or a certain part of the economy goes into a different transaction mode, then the Eurozone might still be, exist, but it might not be what we think it is. And there are various scenarios in which it could sort of not unravel necessarily, but in which it become less important. So that would be my main concern, that we basically, and if we continue to fail investing, and there's a genuine decline, political instability, growing role of Russia and China and Europe, democracy and might be challenged in more countries than in Hungary. This is not just about the Eurozone. So this has a much broader implication for the way of European life.
Okay, well, that's somewhat sort of a morbid note. Let's move on to something a bit more lighter and more personal. A question I always ask my guests is, how do you manage your kind of information research flow? Because obviously you have to keep on top of things. There's all sorts of sources, from Twitter to, releases from governments, EU Commission, whatever. How do you keep on top of things? What's your technique?
My team and I, we are assembling, a news briefing every morning. So we have to basically, be on top of the news flow in Europe. And for that purpose, we read, I'm obviously, I rely on Twitter as everybody else. I have a very sort of very focused Twitter feed, and that also changes all the time. It's an interesting, I've been sort of fine tuning the sources and make sure that it becomes quite diverse. But it's mostly continental European newspapers in various languages. We're monitoring papers from Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and even Finland and Austria in sort of intervals. Twitter, hours is spent on filtering this information. There is an overflow of information. I'm a collector of stuff, so I'm putting things in my media, and I just and in the end we'll pick up something, and then there overflow things. It's like a completely disorganized database that you ultimately search through in some sort of way. But over the years, you fine tune sort of a method, kind of it becomes a workflow. And that workflow is it's becoming important. I find it in terms of information gathering over the years. We've been relying less, especially for Europe, less on English language media over the years. This may have something to do with Brexit, but it's also about quality information. A lot of high quality information, say from Italy, you don't get in any of the English language publications, and also in Germany, most of the really important stuff you need to know, you often pick up from local newspapers sometimes. It's not just one source, but there's a variety of sources. That's a great strength in the variety of Europe, but there aren't any European newspapers or European media. So we spend an awful lot on picking and finding information from those areas. But it's work, and it's quite a lot of people are on it. So it's something that needs to be harbored and picked information.
And the last kind of more personal question is, what book or books have influenced you the most, either personally or on the work front over the years?
Interestingly, given that my focus has been on the Eurozone, one would have thought that sort of the books on economics or politics would have been probably possible. That has not been the case. In fact, I found, especially on the economic side, I found there has been very little in the last, even little written that has had an influence. What has influenced me far more were history books. And I think the single book that influenced me most was Mommsen's magisterial history of the Weimar Republic, which I read as a young man, and which taught me that seemingly stable democracies, how they can collapse. And it taught me to be skeptical about claims that, we're living in different times, that it can't happen here. And so that was probably the most important thing. But there were many other books, but the ones that I sort of kept in my mind, like Margaret MacDonald's Europe 1919 book about the Versailles Treaty, that stuck in my mind. So it was generally on the side of history and economic history that I found more interesting, and taught me also more about what is happening right now than certainly on economics.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then if listeners wanted to follow your work, what's the best place they can follow your work? And, I read your work as well. How can they subscribe to it and so on?
Go to our website. It's called www.eurointelligence.com. And there you can, take a look at what we do. We also do a podcast. once a week. You can listen in, where it's a slightly different format from this one. I like this format here, but we do it sort of more among ourselves, talk about free flow, about what we think just happened this week. My column is there for free. This is not behind the paywall. The main offering is our daily news briefing, which gives sort of an in-depth analysis where we don't say what ought to happen, which is what I do in a column, but where we actually say what we think is going to happen. It's not the same thing often. There's a different flavor. It's geared towards different. I mean, it's geared towards different interests. Political. We have politicians, we have financial investors, but also academics. So there are different models for different users.
Yeah. So I'll include a link on the show notes so people can easily access all of that, both to the newsletter, to your website, but also to the podcast as well. So with that, just wanted to give you a big thank you. That was kind of a very wide-ranging discussion, and it could have gone for much longer, and hopefully I'll have to have you back as well. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And it's great we didn't even discuss Brexit.
I know, yeah, that's great. I always enjoy not talking about Brexit, but
I've not had that in a long time.
Great, thank you. Once again, we'd like to thank Moonfair for sponsoring this episode. Moonfair is now launching its Moonfair Growth Equity Portfolio, a product to make private equity growth and tech funds easier than ever for individual investors to access. The days of buying the post-IPO pop are over. Since the early 2000s, the typical time to IPO has increased from 3 years to 10 years or more, according to a Carlyle Group analysis of research conducted by Texas University's professors Keith Brown and Kenneth Williams. Their work found that investors in these private companies claim 80% of the value created, and Moonfair's growth equity portfolio allows investors to capture much of this value. Growth investors are one of the most interesting pockets of private equity. They target companies oftentimes that are making bold, futuristic bets that will redefine gigantic industries or invent new ones altogether. These products have also found product market fit and begun scaling rapidly, mitigating some of the risk of early-stage venture capital. Fund managers from EQT to BlackRock have launched growth-focused strategies in the last months. Moonfair is putting it at the fingertips of individual investors from minimums as low as $60,000, £50,000, or €50,000. To get started, please visit moonfair.com/macrohive. That's moonfair.com/macrohive and create your free profile. There you can also check out Moonfair's library of white papers exploring topics around private markets investing, along with some of Moonfair's favorite episodes of the podcast. Completing a Moonfair profile is completely free and without any obligations, and will give you access to Moonfair's platform, where you can see which funds are available, check due diligence, documentation, and connect with Moonfair's investor solutions team. It's well worth it. I'd recommend you go onto the site, type in moonfair.com/macrohive, and then you'll be able to look under the hood and get to see what these private equity funds really are doing. With that, thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating and a nice comment. Let other people know about the show. We'd really be grateful. Also, sign up to become a member of Macrohive at macrohive.com. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.